for those of you who do not know Ray, over the last 5 years or so, we have brought Ray here, amongst other things, courtesy of the Air Force Academy, because Ray and I work with the scholars students there, competing for UK scholarships and so on. But I can tell you, as from my time in running the Pittsburgh Council, I've known Ray since, well, he was quite a young lad, and I was quite a young lad, and that was a long time ago. It was in the last century. When we first met, Ray was at the time a political officer in the British Consulate General in New York. And for those who don't know what a political officer is, it's not a CIA or an MI5 plant, although I'm not entirely sure about that. But the British Foreign Service has a tradition of taking a couple of very bright people and then leaving them in key places in the world. New York, St. Petersburg, and so on. Separate from the embassy, part in this case of the Consulate General, in which without really being, having the position of ambassador or other title, this nondescript title of political officer means that within that patch of the consulate, which really included most of the Northeast, Ray knows everybody. I was amazed in Pittsburgh, because Pittsburgh was fortunate for us in Ray's patch, and that he was often in Pittsburgh developing not only economic connections between the United States and Britain, but also political connections. If anybody wanted to know, coming from Downing Street or London, wanted to know the state of American politics, it was Ray who was always writing the papers for the ambassador in Washington or for the consulate. And you can well imagine that in the wake of 9/11, Ray was a very busy man, as virtually anybody who was anybody in British government and industry was cycling into New York, and Ray was organizing all of their trips and introducing them to all of the people that one needs to know. So I've known Ray for coming on 20 years, and I can still say, quite literally, I know of no one who knows the American political scene better than Ray. Now, for the last, I'm losing track, Ray, the last several years, I want to say 7, you have been retired from the British Diplomatic Service, teaching at State University of New York as a professor, special advisor to the Chancellor of the SUNY system, an incredible asset in the fields of education, also doing a lot of writing and some consulting as well. We have worked together for 14 years and on the Marshall Committee for Marshall Scholarship Selection Committee from the New York region, in which Ray served as chair, and I had the pleasure to serve with him. He has taught not only at SUNY, but he remains an adjunct professor at the Social Science Department at West Point. He was the Jackson visiting professor for 1 year, a long-standing relationship with that, to the Air Force Academy cadets, that other school on the Hudson. And so he's a master educator, one of the most well-read and well-informed persons that I know, and it is always a treat to bring him back to this organization. He's educated in Ireland, in Dublin, PhD from the University of Kansas, a Humphrey Fellowship at Yale as a postdoc. We did, if you notice on the World Affairs Council website, we just jointly published a piece called Balanced Internationalism in the National Interest, which we're forcing all the cadets to read for tomorrow. But the subject is different every year, but it is always a pleasure to have Ray come and give his perspective on some aspect of the transatlantic relationship. Because even though he is a British subject, I know of no one who was more committed to enriching and cementing the Anglo-American relationship across the pond. So with that modest introduction that I can go on for a lot longer, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you my good friend, Dr. Ray Raymond.
Sky, thank you for that extraordinarily kind introduction. And I can only reply in the immortal words of Mark Twain, when someone was kind enough to introduce him in similarly generous terms. And they were that you deserve to go to heaven for your generosity. Wait for it. And to the other place for your exaggeration. I can only say that in the interest of objectivity, may I say that if you want a more accurate account of my nefarious past, you may find it on the FBI's most wanted list, where since the Navy SEALs took down bin Laden, I've sort of moved up the list. Easier to find, you know? Easier to find. Now, I take particular pleasure this evening in reminding you why we are here. It's not to hear about Brexit or anything else, which, by the way, is not a new brand of Kellogg's breakfast cereal, but rather to, first of all, remind you that this month marks the 50th anniversary of the release of the Beatles' seminal album, Revolver, which took popular music to a really serious level. Eleanor Rigby, Gotta Get You Into My Life, Good Day Sunshine, really took popular music to an entirely different level. You know, it really did. A seminal album. And it's also, more sadly, in fact, it's also this 50th anniversary of the Beatles' last formal concert, which was at Candlestick Park in San Francisco this month, 50 years ago. And when Candlestick Park closed, which it did just about a year or so ago, who actually was the last concert played there? Sir Paul McCartney played there with his backing band. So that's the real reason I'm here, is just to remind you of these important things. My sons, by the way, lest I ever forget, my sons for Father's Day gave me these two wonderful, this lovely set of cufflinks. It goes, the Beatles, Apple, absolutely right. Oh, and by the way, to all Academy cadets, right, new requirement, honors program, September the 15th, Ron Howard's movie, The Touring Years, the Beatles 1962-66, is out in theaters on September the 15th. And the amazing live performances at the Hollywood Bowl, Shea Stadium, etc. Great days, great days. Now,
so are there any questions?
Anyway, let's get down to serious business. What I do want to talk to you about, not that the Beatles are not serious business, they are, but seriously, I want to talk to you first of all about what happened in Britain, Brexit. What happened? Why it happened? What are the implications within European politics? And what lessons we can draw, because there's a rather interesting, if you'll forgive me saying so, horrifying election campaign been going on here, but what lessons we can see, and there are some interesting lessons, and then just a brief word on the impact on the special relationship. Because Sky's emphasized my American credentials, I have also worked in British politics. I was an advisor to Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, so I've worked briefly in Downing Street, and I've had a lot of this British politics experience as well. So, let's get started. Like today, globalization in its earlier phases, we're really in globalization about phase 4, I think, actually. Globalization has usually divided societies. It's created income inequality. It's created social tensions. And as a result, not surprisingly, globalization has triggered consequences, political responses, ranging from xenophobia to political extremism of the left and of the right. There's nothing new in all this. We've been here before over the past 400 to 500 years or so. But globalization, I think, and the impact it has, reflects, I think, each country's politics in subtly different ways. It reflects, basically, because the forces it unleashes, reflects the country's socioeconomic structure, its level of industrialization, its political culture, and its political system. And as we shall see, Britain is a particularly interesting case study of all of this. So, I'm a great aficionado of American popular culture, so let's really test you guys, right? Joe Friday. Joe Friday, Sergeant Joe Friday, shame upon you all. He always wanted the facts. Just the facts. So let's begin with just the facts, all right? Okay, the UK voted 52 to 48 to leave. In England, which has 85% of the population of the United Kingdom, it was 53-47. In Scotland, however, it was 62-33 to remain in. In Northern Ireland, it was 56-44 to remain in. Wales, it was 52-48 to leave, but with one important caveat. Cardiff, its capital, voted 60-40 to stay in. Interesting. Now, who actually voted to leave? They were older voters, poorer voters, the less educated part of the electorate, those without a college degree. Manual workers, casual workers, rural voters, pensioners, that's to say those living on the British equivalent of social security, the unemployed, the underemployed. And that's largely, and they were English overwhelmingly. This was overwhelmingly a revolt of those left behind. And in England, it was overwhelmingly against staying in the European Union with important caveats. Greater London. Greater London. London and the home counties. I was reminding people that, London is a capital of a country that doesn't exist. It's a global city. It's an amazing global city. But Greater London voted by a colossal margin to stay in the European Union. Manchester, which is experiencing an old industrial city, experiencing a spectacular regeneration, voted to stay in. But England's West Country, where my family roots are, the Midlands, the old industrial Midlands, and the northern industrial northeastern parts of the United Kingdom all voted to leave. Now, in brief, those who voted to leave were those who were to be found very largely in dying industrial towns, decaying old seaside resorts, the poorer parts of rural England, East Anglia, that bits of Britain that sort of sticks out that away towards Scandinavia, and that away that looks like the sole of your shoe sticks out into the Atlantic. They were people, I think, alienated from London, alienated from Britain's political, financial, and business elites. They were people left behind by globalization. So, who voted for? Let's deal with the Scots first. Scotland has had long-standing ties to the European continent. Every single county in Scotland voted to stay in the European Union. Every single county. And there were colossal votes in support, over 80-20 in cities like Edinburgh and Glasgow. In England, it was the metropolitan elites, the highly educated, who supported the Remain in the EU campaign. They were to be found in successful multicultural cities, and indeed they were to be found amongst young people, aged particularly sort of 18 to 24, but those also up to their middle 30s as well. Essentially, they were those who have done well as a result of globalization. Those who had money, those who had nothing to fear from immigration, those who had an outgoing, forward-looking international mindset, those who really embraced the challenges of the 21st century with energy and enthusiasm, those who were forward-looking, those who were struggling with globalization, those without money, those without skills, fearful of immigration, those were those who voted overwhelmingly against. Now, those are the facts. Why? Why? Well, I begin my analysis with what I can only describe as monumental political incompetence on the part of David Cameron and George Osborne. This referendum did not have to happen, and all the negative consequences did not have to happen either. David Cameron and George Osborne launched this referendum to fix an internal party problem inside the Conservative Party. Let's be frank about it. That's what they did. They wanted to shut up the rump. There's about 50 of them, sort of extreme so-called Eurosceptics within the Conservative Party. Ironically, by the way, it didn't solve that problem, and it wrecked the leadership of the Labour Party as well. Anyway, we will get on to the nefarious doings of Mrs. Cameron and Osborne in just a moment. David Cameron and George Osborne failed to learn from their near-death experience in Scotland in 2014, when they had chronically mismanaged the referendum in Scotland and were only saved at the last minute, by the Scottish business community and by Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, who is himself Scottish. The big lesson, though, that they really failed to learn is this. They failed to offer a positive case for remaining in and a positive vision of Britain in the European Union, just as they failed to offer a positive vision for the Union of the United Kingdom, something I must confess I'm very deeply committed to. But they failed to offer that positive vision. It was all basically, it was called Operation Fear, scare the living bejesus out of people. Well, it didn't work. It almost didn't work in Scotland, and it certainly didn't work in England. They failed to learn that if you've got to do more than just throw negative statistics at people. You've got to engage them and offer them a positive, constructive vision, in this case, of remaining in the UK. The result, as you probably know, has been monumental political chaos in Britain on an unprecedented scale, with both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party collapsing into an orgy of backstabbing and betrayal worthy of the Borgias in Renaissance Italy. And just to make life even more interesting, Messrs. Johnson, Gove, and Farage, having driven Britain over the abyss, now decided that it was time to press their ripcord and, parachute out. Farage resigned as leader of the UK Independence Party, right? Boris Johnson withdrew from the contest for leadership of the Conservative Party, and Michael Gove soon followed him. Thanks, guys. Really helpful. For a time, an alarmingly long time, it must be said, in June and July, Britain had no plan, no government, no opposition. Today, I would add, it does have a government, but it still has no plan and no opposition. And watch this space. There may be a split in the Labour Party coming within a matter of weeks, as the Labour Party, as you probably know, has elected last year through an interesting exercise in shenanigans about who's eligible to vote, an unreconstructed Trotskyite, a sort of 1970s era British communist. Well, I can't see him getting elected into Downing Street, can you? I certainly can't. In trying to appease this rump of Eurosceptic Conservative backbenchers, by offering them a referendum, David Cameron and George Osborne, listen to this, destroyed their government, threatened very seriously the integrity of the United Kingdom. The Scots are understandably seething with anger with England over this, destabilized the European Union, probably irrevocably damaged the City of London, which is not only a global cultural center, it is the world's global financial center, and weakened US and European security. Now, I don't know about you, but to me that takes some doing. That takes some doing. That takes some level of mind-boggling incompetence. But also under the heading of political incompetence, I also want to bring in open this lens to a wider European picture as well. Because the EU itself and the leaders of key European EU member states must also accept a very large level of responsibility for their own political incompetence in helping to cause this mess that Europe and Britain indeed is going to be dealing with for at least the next 2 years. It's important to remember that the original European economic community, formed back in the 1950s, was an elite project, in the best sense of that term. Jean Monnet, the great French diplomat, civil servant, the great founding father of the European Union, and other elite European diplomats and civil servants, their ministers and their prime ministers, with great skill, enmeshed Western European nation states in a wider, interdependent whole in which they created not only great prosperity, but peace. The idea that France and Germany would never go to war with each other again. A fantastic accomplishment, it really was. But, and I borrow this phrase from a prominent European commentator, peace by stealth, because that's what it was peace by stealth, is all very well. But this peace by stealth, this elite process of stealthy diplomacy, and its success in the 1950s, 1960s, into the 70s indeed, imbued, I think, European diplomatic, political, bureaucratic, banking elites with a deep disrespect for public opinion and the democratic process. Certainly when it came to referendums that turned out with the wrong result, i.e. where voters actually said, no thank you, we don't want ever closer European integration. The arrogance and I think the disrespect for popular sovereignty helped to fuel support for the UK Independence Party and for the Leave campaign more generally. It also left EU elites, to be frank, with a political tin ear, right? A total political tin ear, incapable of hearing the cries of popular resentment and frustration coming from British voters, so that they just couldn't believe for 1 second that British voters would vote against the EU, and indeed, they didn't give David Cameron the one concession I think that just might have turned this around. And that was what he'd asked for, was a braking mechanism, as in your case, sort of a brake mechanism on immigration, such that if they'd reached a certain number, then Britain could say enough was enough, right? They didn't want to hear that. And so they bear a large share of responsibility, I think, themselves. In addition, bear in mind, this has all come against a background of European voters who believe, quite rightly, that the EU has failed to solve the refugee crisis, although there are many other parties responsible for that too. It has failed to address successfully the euro crisis. If you think the euro crisis is over, hang on to your wallets and watch your investment portfolios, because it's not. And of course, it's helped to fuel Russian adventurism by our nice, cuddly, fuzzy, friendly man sitting in the Kremlin. Yeah. I first encountered Mr. Putin when he was KGB station chief in Dresden. I shall say no more. I would like to also then turn to other, more purely domestic British factors. I think a second major factor has to be the fact of a yawning chasm between British voters and their government and their political parties. It's truly a yawning chasm. Because what you had was all the major political parties in Britain. This was not a party issue, remember. This was a referendum in which the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democratic Party, the Scottish Nationalist Party, the Welsh Nationalist Party, and the parties in Northern Ireland, everybody, all the organised major political parties were all saying, stay in, stay in, stay in. And yet the people voted no, by a limited majority, but still they did. Interesting. If that is not a yawning chasm between voters and political elites, I do not know one. I just don't know one. In addition, this was, I think one could add to that, a revolt by the English working class. And it was English and it was working class against a political and economic system that, rightly or wrongly, they believed was rigged against them. In addition, there was the British tabloid press. British people read newspapers assiduously. We do. And the British tabloid press for the past 40 years has relentlessly argued against the EU. They have featured stories from their correspondents in Brussels, many of them made up, actually. Some of them by Boris Johnson, by the way, made up. Boris and no facts. Yeah. And their editorials, relentlessly hostile to the European Union, irrespective of the facts. Now, Lord knows the EU can be infuriating at times, and it deserves to be held to account when it's done wrong. But, every time, every day, every week for 40 years. And the readers of those newspapers were, you guessed it, the people who voted no. Okay. But there was, I think, something else going on behind all of this. And I don't think, leaving aside austerity and these other economic factors, and I think it's impossible to exaggerate the role of immigration. David Cameron promised that his government would limit the arrival of immigrants to Britain from the rest of the European Union, not from outside, but from the rest of the EU, to 100,000 per year. Okay. Unfortunately, UK official statistics for 2015 for last year show 336,000 immigrants from the rest of the EU came into Britain, 3 times larger than that. And this, I'm afraid, created fertile soil in which the Leave campaign planted xenophobic seeds which rapidly grew into poisonous plants with leaves covered with thick layers of nativism, racism, and Islamophobia. And I mention Islamophobia particularly because in the closing weeks of the referendum campaign, the Leave campaign, in one of its most outrageous and irresponsible actions, suggested that Turkey, with its 77 million Muslims, would soon join the European Union. Now, anybody who knows anything about the EU or European politics knows that that is absolute, utter nonsense. UK polling data shows that the focus on Turkey and the possibility that Britain would have to accept hundreds of thousands of Muslim immigrants pushed immigration to the forefront of voters' concerns, even though it had absolutely no foundation in fact whatsoever. Okay, the what, the why. Let's take a look-see at what it did to wider European politics, with obvious damage to the United States. I think there are 3 consequences, very briefly. First is, Brexit, I think, gave far-right secessionist groups in France, Austria, and the Netherlands renewed confidence that they too could push forward with their argument, and indeed that they might prevail in a referendum in either France, Austria, or the Netherlands. Brexit legitimized their ideas and emboldened the politicians who championed them. Secondly, I think Brexit made it harder, much harder, for the European Union to deal with its current crop of problems, which in all fairness would cripple any major power, all of them happening simultaneously. Its economic growth crisis, its refugee crisis, the euro crisis, and of course the increasing threats to European security coming from Vladimir Putin. And I think on that last point, let me just add that I'm in very little doubt that Brexit has encouraged Russian adventurism, because for the next several years at least the next 2 years, the British government and its European Union partners will have to devote a colossal amount of time and energy, finite time and finite energy, to working out a process whereby Britain can leave or may leave the EU. It will leave the EU divided and distracted. And Mr. Putin is laughing in the Kremlin. And when he's laughing in the Kremlin, we should be very, very worried indeed. Okay, let's turn back to a little bit of election analysis, because there is an extraordinary campaign going on I know the World Affairs Council is non-profit, non-partisan, non-everything else, and so on and so forth, so I'm going to be as scrupulously non-partisan as I can. I'll try. First, 2 words of context. If we look at, what lessons can we draw in just voting behavior, what lessons can we draw from the electoral politics of all of this? I think the first of all, is to make just 2 brief points of context, to put this into its wider context for a second. First of all, in the UK, what you had was a referendum on a policy proposal. It wasn't an election. It was not an election. It was a referendum on a policy proposal which cut right across party lines. It cuts right across geography, party lines, right across the board. And the US election is, of course, between 2 established political parties and between 2 very, very well-known political candidates, right? So it's a different animal. The second is that I think in the UK electorate, Britain's electorate only has a very, very small minority of minority voters. The US has a large number who are growing rapidly and registering to vote in record numbers. So the resistance to bigotry, xenophobia, will be much, much more forceful here, not just from good, decent people of all races, all classes, all religions, but from those communities more directly affected, because they have far, far, far bigger political clout than minority voters in Britain ever did during the referendum. By the way, try winning Florida, Colorado, Nevada, Virginia without Latino voters. Right? Okay. So, what are the lessons? I think the Brexit vote is, to a degree, really is an ominous portent for the United States elections, because it shows that angry, frustrated, and indeed even desperate voters are willing to take political risks to a degree that would have been incomprehensible 5 years ago. That's worrying. It shows that voters are losing their fear, if you will, of leaping into the abyss of uncertainty. That should worry us. It should worry us, not just now, but in the years to come, here in the United States. Secondly, it should also remind us that elites can be so blind and so politically tone deaf. They really can be so politically tone deaf. As I commented earlier, the Brexit vote was in part a cry of anger and frustration from a polarized white working class, and indeed older voters as well, against decades of deindustrialization, globalization, unrestricted immigration from the rest of the EU, and a loss of cultural identity. And those factors have been playing out in the electorate here. They have. And we would do wise to be aware of how elites can be so blind and so politically tone deaf. They really can be. Interestingly, though, what was surprising about the result of the referendum in Britain, and I wasn't surprised actually, but that British elites were surprised. They were flabbergasted, stunned. They couldn't believe it. It happened. American elites, beware. A third one, and I've alluded to this briefly earlier, populist rebellions. Populist rebellions cannot be crushed by dire economic warnings of the consequences of populist success. Psychology matters, you know. Emotions matter. Of course they do. Emotions matter. British voters were too angry to listen to elite authorities because they so distrusted them. It takes a positive vision with a compelling slogan to actually convince people. If you want to go back in American history, you know, Ronald Reagan's Morning in America, 1984. Very powerful, very compelling stuff, you know? And I think Hillary Clinton would do well to learn. One may agree or not agree. One that's being scrupulously, I don't want to see the World Affairs Council losing their 501c3 status here. But, you know, I mean, you know, Donald Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," is pretty catchy. You know, it resonates, it's pretty catchy. And I would hope Hillary Clinton would come up with a better one than she has already. And lastly, voter turnout matters. By God, does it matter. And this one is addressed to younger voters, millennials, like young Sky Foster over here. In all the polling running up to the referendum, 73% of young British millennials said, we want Britain to stay in the European Union, we want our future to be in Europe, and all that marvelous stuff. Fine, great. Only 36% of British millennials voted. 36%. Down, by the way, down from 43% the year earlier in the British general election. And then British millennials are going around crying in their teacups, oh, our future is ruined. Oh. Well, my message to them is very simple. Get off, and my message to all of you millennials is all the same. Get off your bloody apps. Get off the texting and all the Twittering and the Instagrams and all these other bloody things, but be prepared to get out and vote. Vote. Voter turnout matters at the end of the day. It matters. And young British millennials failed to turn out. Can you imagine me? 36% of them turned out at the end of the day. If even about 55% of them turned out, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. Voter turnout matters. Lastly, just turning very quickly to the wider transatlantic relationship, and I just want to touch on two very, very brief points on this. One I am very worried about, one I'm perhaps not so worried about, but I thought I should flag it for you anyway. The one I am worried about is this. In the special relationship, and having worked it as a diplomat for 20 years, I know this, having devoted much of my life and career to it. The United States is going to lose its key ally in the European Union. That's a fact. The real diplomatic value that successive US administrations have focused on the US-UK special relationship, leaving the military side aside for a second and the intelligence stuff aside for a minute. But the diplomatic value is that it has given the United States a seat by proxy at the European Union table in Brussels. By and large, British priorities have been American priorities, and British influence has helped keep the European Union less insular, less regulated, more open to free trade, and more likely to support economic sanctions against our nice fuzzy friend in the Kremlin when he chooses to violate sovereign countries' borders in Russia, in Europe. The United States will find itself without British influence in Brussels, and it was going to be forced to build a new relationship with Germany. And that, as the man said, ain't going to be easy. Try replacing 80 years of intimate diplomatic trust with a new relationship with Germany. It's not going to be easy, folks. It will not be easy. And honestly, I doubt that it will happen. On the security and intelligence side, I'm not that worried. The National Security Agency, the NSA, GCHQ, special relationship will continue unabated. No issues there, no particular worries there. In fact, the EU has been, as unfortunately Mr. Snowden let the cat out of the bag on that one, is that GCHQ and the NSA jointly spied on European countries, the EU member countries. But, you know, everybody spies on everybody else. Let's be grown up about this, except the British and Americans. And indeed, just as Britain's MI6 was the midwife at the birth of the CIA, the GCHQ NSA relationship will be fine. Mothers, babies, and midwives have enjoyed an exceptionally intimate relationship over the past 70 years. That will not change at all. The one thing that does worry me slightly is the relationship, the MI5 FBI relationship. That will remain close, but as I think we've seen in recent terrorist attacks in Paris, Nice, Brussels, Istanbul, have demonstrated the need for much closer, more effective intra-European intelligence sharing. Now, MI5 is a superb domestic intelligence agency, I would submit arguably the best of its kind in the world. But an important part of its value to the United States lies in the intelligence that it gleans about possible terrorist plots from other EU partners. Cut off from the fullest possible access to shared European intelligence, MI5 would be of less value to US counterterrorist activities, to US counterterrorism efforts. But I'm not terribly worried about that. Theresa May, the new Prime Minister, was the Home Secretary for 6 years, in effect, Justice Secretary. She supervised MI5 for 6 years, so she will really understand its value, she will understand the value of the special relationship, and whatever else she does, she'll ensure that there will be effective shared intelligence between the EU. So, I mean, it's just a point of concern worth flagging, I think, but it's not one I am particularly worried about. Okay. Do please forgive me, I've spoken for far too long, and I don't want to emulate the long-winded British politician of whom Winston Churchill once commented that he has exhausted time and encroached upon eternity. So I look forward to your questions, comments, and insults.
Let me just repeat them for the camera. One is the implications for the euro, if any, because Britain was not in the financial center, but not part of the euro. And secondly, domestic policy. How do you bring back into the political conversation those voters that have felt like, to use your phrase, have been left behind?
Right. Two great questions, Sam. The first point is that the euro crisis is not over, by any means. And the members of the Eurozone were going to have to work on some very, what we all know, anybody's thought about the economics and the finance of this knows has to happen. A European banking union, the further surrender of Eurozone member countries' control over their budgets, the greater empowerment of the European Central Bank, the creation of a Europe-wide equivalent to the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation here in the US, which doesn't exist at the moment. In other words, the key financial and economic underpinnings were necessary, right? Now, if you are, there's a limited amount of ministerial time, there's a limited amount of official time. If they are going to be focused, and they will be, on Brexit, on working out these very, very difficult and very complicated negotiations with Britain, they're going to be spending political capital. And that's political capital they won't have to spend to persuade the member countries of the Eurozone to make these changes that are necessary in order to provide a long-term foundation for the Eurozone. To your second point, excellent point again, Theresa May has grasped this point very clearly, I think. She has talked about, you know, a new kind of capitalism. She's talked about, if you will, making major efforts to ensure that, you know, people are not left behind. She's really gotten this message loud and clear on the need for, I think, what some of us of a, you know, of a somewhat earlier generation would call one-nation Toryism. You know, one-nation Toryism. Harold Macmillan, Peter Walker, who was very much Lord Walker, who was very much a mentor of mine, but very much a kinder brand of capitalism, and I think that's all to the good. A serious effort to what she calls industrial strategy. That's a term which has very unfortunate connotations in Britain because it goes back to the failed Labour Party efforts of the 1960s and 1970s, and the Conservatives as well. But nonetheless, I think she understands that this needs to happen. Let's see how she articulates the specifics of that, because we don't really know yet. But she certainly sees it, grasps it, and is determined to fix it. We'll have to wait and see. Okay.
Right. This is a referendum, as you pointed out, and Parliament still has to enact steps to take action. Otherwise, it's simply an expression of public opinion. So what are the prospects of that happening within the British Parliament?
My short answer is most unlikely. But what's happened in British politics over the past 2.5 months are unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented. a prime minister forced to resign and his number two forced to resign, the Conservative Party thrown into chaos, the Labour Party thrown into chaos, a Labour Party leader repudiated by 182 members of his own parliamentary party, a leadership challenge which has not been resolved yet by any means, and depending on the outcome of that, you may see the emergence. It is possible, I won't predict it, but it's possible to see the Labour Party essentially collapse. You may see a new party emerging with all those members that refuse to stand by Jeremy Corbyn, essentially establish themselves as a new party. All of that said, I do think it's most unlikely. Although, again, there's so many imponderables here. Remember, its precise legal status was as a referendum, as an advisory document, if you will. That's precisely correct. Yeah, exactly so. It's got no standing. Now, Theresa May is quite rightly waiting until into next year to actually pull the trigger on this, because that trigger will take the form of a formal letter from her as Prime Minister to President Tusk, the Polish current chair of the permanent President of the European Council. What will happen between now and then? For example, watch out for the results of, there is a legal challenge which has been taken up in the High Court, and it could go to Britain's Supreme Court. Now, that Supreme Court has very, very limited at any constitutional functions, but its argument essentially is that that Parliament should set aside the results of this referendum, and that this referendum should basically be pushed aside, and that Parliament has the right to do that, the duty to do that, and it will do so. We will wait and see how that plays out. I honestly don't think so. I don't think it'll happen. It was narrow, 52-48, but it will be very, very difficult for a British Prime Minister to ignore such a powerful expression of public opinion. Let me say this, though. There will be other opportunities to decide how all this plays out, because whatever Theresa May says now, she will have to do another referendum, not this year or next year. But once the negotiations are done, if they are actually done, that's another huge imponderable, right? Huge imponderable. Because we're not talking about one agreement, we're talking about at least two and probably three major agreements, all working on a different timetable, all working on different issues. That, if you want to put those three together, and you'll have to, those will have to be voted on again by the British people. There could be another referendum, there will be, in my view, there will have to be another referendum by about 2019.
Could you clarify why another referendum as opposed to an act of Parliament?
Because the issue is just so explosive. I mean, you're walking into a minefield. You're walking into a minefield. So yeah, there would be, this is an issue of such transcendent importance that they would have to do it. They would have to put whatever has been agreed, if anything is agreed, by the way, and after that, all the other 27 member countries have to agree to it too, right? So, there's so many imponderables out there. But in the short term, I do honestly wish that we could have, Parliament, and there is a majority in Parliament to stand up and do it, but I doubt the political courage is there to do it, because I just don't see enough serious, mature grown-ups in the leadership of both parties to stand up and say, look, A, the British people were sold a pack of lies, which they were, by the Leave campaign. B, this was such a narrow. C, do you now understand that we're looking at the potential breakup of the United Kingdom? And we're not just talking about Scotland, we're talking about introducing a hard border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland again, which would be awful, because that would affect the underpinnings, the economic and other legal underpinnings of the Northern Ireland peace process, which I had a very, very small role to play in. you know, talk about self-inflicted wounds on a colossal scale. I wish that Parliament would just stand up and say, this is rubbish. You know, sorry folks, thank you very much, but you know, you were totally misled and we're going to assert ourselves as Parliament and we're going to say no. But I don't think it's going to, sadly, I don't think it's going to happen. But don't worry, another, about 2.5 years from now, from I would say middle of 2019, look out for something else happening again. And we may even have a general election. As remember, Theresa May's majority is David Cameron's majority, because there hasn't been an election. And it's very slender. It's very, very slender. You could see that rump group of extreme Eurosceptics accuse even her, and remember she was not a member of the Leave campaign, saying, oh, you've utterly betrayed us, and then force a vote of no confidence in the British Parliament, and there's a snap election called. It could happen. Given this year, anything could happen.
And one kind of a follow-on from that, one could conceive of such an election were called or made necessary. It becomes itself a form of that referendum.
It would indeed. It would be a referendum by proxy. Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
Now, I'm going to go right to here, but I have an unpaid political announcement. This is sublime to the ridiculous. If you have a credit card charge for your bar tab, the bartender is standing by, waiting for signatures and to return your credit card. So I think this is kind of important. So anyway, yes, ma'am.
Go ahead.
Is this media commercialism or is it media believing that it was acting in the best interests of British society?
Right. Okay. First of all, I think it's a great question, and one has to distinguish between the media. We're talking, when I made reference, we're talking about the tabloid press. The tabloid press, and that's just as distinct from the serious press, like the Financial Times, the Independent, because London has so many newspapers, the Financial Times, the Times, the Sunday Times, the Observer, all these serious newspapers, they were all in favor of remaining in. What we're talking about is the tabloid press. Let me give, pardon me? Oh, they have great influence, absolutely. As the old joke goes, the Financial Times and the Times are read by those who run the country. The Daily Telegraph is read by those who used to run the country. And certain tabloid newspapers, particularly The Sun, are read by those who couldn't care less who's running the country, so long as the young lady on page 3 has no clothes on. Okay? That's the British press for you. The British television media were, I think, with the exception of Murdoch's Sky News, but the BBC tried to be neutral. They really, really tried to be neutral. ITV, Channel 4 was neutral. So you're really talking about the tabloids. And they were drumming up business. Of course they were. Absolutely. I mean, they were drumming up business. And they're in a situation where, because of the impact of the internet, the impact of online news sites and so forth, that in Britain, as here, traditional newspapers the circulation has been shrinking a great deal. And even they've been shrinking. But yeah, this was about crass commercialism. I think it was crass commercialism and prejudice. And prejudice. And also a kind of a wistful, well, not wistful, that's too nice, willfully myopic nostalgia for a Britain of 50, 60 years ago that was still at the hub of a great global empire. I mean, sorry guys, the world's moved on, the empire's gone. Get real, get real. And they don't want to move that. And those sorts of voters, particularly older voters, and remember, Britain only really lost the bulk of its empire in the 1950s and 1960s. So there's lots of people around who remember that big British empire, I mean, when I was a little chap about that size, in my little short pants, and I went to school, I had a wonderful Scottish teacher who would begin every lesson by saying, now, boys and girls, look at the pink bits. Look, have a look. These are the pink bits. The pink bits are all the British Empire. And this is in the 60s, for God's sake, and there's still an awful lot of them in those days. So, there's an awful lot of people around, of adults around, who remember that very, very clearly. And
So
They pandered to them. But it was also about crass commercialism, selling newspapers. Pardon me? I think they are. Because they were like
they are regretting it.
They, our questioner asked, I'm sorry, are they regretting it? I think so. Because, for example, the facts which were brought home by the International Monetary Fund, the Bank of England, leading economists all said, look, if we vote for Brexit, there's going to be serious economic trouble. And there has been. The pound has fallen to its lowest rate in 35 years. The day after Brexit, British people lost 100 billion pounds of liquid wealth the following day. Now, it's come back a bit, but all the indicators are that the UK economy is sliding into recession. Talk about self-induced madness. Yeah, it really is. And I think people are sobering up. And I think if this referendum was held again next month, you'd get a very different result, and not the least. Oh, no. Oh, no.
We got 3 questions, 1, 2, and then 3.
Yeah.
So we'll start back there.
Yeah.
Do you see certain kinds of things happening in the U.S. if a particular person gets elected, or even if that person doesn't get elected? Let's just leave it. Let's leave it that way.
Yeah. No. No, that certain person will not get elected. If the election was held today, there would be an electoral college landslide of at least 350 electoral college votes for the other candidate. Okay. For better or worse, depending on your point of view, since we're all non-scrupulous, non-partisan, non-partisan, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, no. NATO is a different order of magnitude. And by the way, one of the ways that Britain will be striving to, if you will, make up for that loss of diplomatic influence with the United States will be through a stepped-up effort in NATO. One of the new, for example, spearhead battalions in the Baltic republics is a British battalion. And so there will be a lot of effort, and I hope, and I think certainly under Theresa May, there will be an effort to rebuild Britain's defences, which have been shamelessly cut by David Cameron and George Osborne. Right. She's just voted to extend, basically, to pay £35 billion, that's about $70 billion, to extend and modernise Britain's independent nuclear deterrent, which will be obviously closely matching with the modernization of the Trident program here in the US. So no. And remember, I mean, yeah, there is an extraordinary cohesion within NATO, right? An extraordinary cohesion with NATO, in together, out together. If you look at Afghanistan, you look at any major conflict that we've been engaged in, we're all in it together. There's great institutional coherence. And I think also the likelihood of the US withdrawing from NATO is not going to happen. Of course, remember, the United States is treaty bound. The United States is a law-based state, and you can't just walk away from treaty obligations, as the US Supreme Court has reminded past administrations, Democratic and Republican alike. You can't just walk away from treaty obligations.
You have a sip of water.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yes.
Yes. You mentioned the former mayor, Boris Johnson, a former mayor of London, now has a new role as Foreign Secretary. And how do you see that relationship? How do you see him playing in this transatlantic relationship in particular?
Right. Interesting question. In diplomatic circles, Boris Johnson is viewed as a bloody joke. He is an interesting, erudite. I rather enjoy people who can conduct press conferences in French. That's rather nifty. And I love people in public life who can actually quote Latin. I think that's rather splendid. That's splendid. That's splendid. And I like seeing a Balliol College Oxford man as Foreign Secretary. That's all fine. Those are generics. But Boris Johnson has a terrible reputation as a liar and as an inventor of facts. When he was a journalist in Brussels, filing a lot of these dispatches on the EU, the European Commission, understandably, filed formal complaints against him on numerous occasions because the facts were made up. He just made them up out of the air. Huh? he has a reputation for lying. His behavior during the course of the Leave campaign was disgraceful. He told blatant lies repeatedly, day in and day out. One of them was that Britain contributed over £350 billion a year once we came out of the European Union. That'd be wonderful, and all that money could go in the National Health Service. It's a total lie. The actual figure that Britain does pay into on a yearly basis is less than a third of that. And a lot of that money comes back in the form of infrastructure to poorer parts of the United Kingdom, right? And it comes back in the form of research funding to universities, which are in panic mode all throughout the UK. And, he's also written outrageous, insulting things about President Obama. He said, was totally prejudiced against Britain because of his Kenyan roots. Well, President Obama was born in Hawaii, and he hardly ever knew his father at all. And by the way, that Churchill bust, which I, by the way, happened to get it. It was my idea, and I happened to one of the people who get it there. That Churchill bust is still there. It's not actually in the Oval Office, but sits right outside the Oval Office. So that's a lie to start off with as well. He said outrageous things about Hillary Clinton, likening her to a nurse with sadistic eyes, a nurse working in a mental asylum. And this man is Foreign Secretary? And I noted with interest that the State Department spokesman, who was a retired Navy admiral, former Pentagon spokesman, could barely stifle a laugh when someone asked him about it. So he's got a hell of a lot of making up of ground to do. He had a nice press conference with John Kerry, and obviously we'll see who the next Secretary of State will be, but he's got a huge amount of apologies to make for outrageous and irresponsible comments as a journalist, and a huge uphill struggle to establish his credibility.
Eric.
An issue that we and Britain share is the employability of a whole generation, in a sense the post-2008 generation that has not been able to accumulate wealth and been difficult to find jobs, find the way into the workplace. Present company who have graduation jobs already accepted.
They are well educated.
Yes. So you have this combination of You have this combination of education, but the inability to find a job, a lot of disaffection on both sides of the Atlantic. What are the kinds of things that Prime Minister May might put in place in Britain to try and bring that younger population into the fold in form of a jobs program, education, or whatever?
Absolutely. Can I first of all say that I identify with what you've said very personally. I am the parent of a millennial who graduated from a very fine college in Massachusetts, albeit his degree was in art, and as you know, there's a booming job market there. But he has returned to take up residence, and that's fine. William is my son, and I love him, and I love him dearly. But I had to have some heart-to-heart talks with him and his steady girlfriend, Marissa. They have been going out together for 2.5 years, and they were talking a lot of fantasy. I said, look, guys, neither of you has a job, neither of you has a down payment on anything. So believe me, this is a problem that's very personal, because I live in the United States. I live in Hudson Valley. And I have another millennial, if you define millennials, born in 1999. I'm not sure on the definition, but now he is very determined and very focused. I think he will be fine. But yeah, so this is in my home every day, I can tell you. And you're right. And by the way, the long-term effect on the United States economic growth is going to be very, very dangerous. I think Theresa May probably will. I mean, this is pure speculation on my part, because we don't know yet. She has talked along these lines. But we've not had any specifics yet. But I wouldn't be in the least surprised if she did, because there's a real need. There are huge parts of Britain where you have not just one generation suffering from structural unemployment. I mean, parts of Wales, parts of the old industrial northeast of England, I'm thinking of Newcastle and Sunderland and those sorts of areas, which were once, thriving shipbuilding parts. Britain started losing its shipbuilding industry in the early 1960s. So yeah, there has to be some major effort on this. I think she, in terms of ideologically where she's expressing herself, it would be certainly consistent if she did. But she hasn't said anything specifically yet. We really haven't seen a specific program yet, nor will we until Parliament comes back. Parliament's on its summer recess. It probably won't come back till the end of September, beginning of October. Because she needs time to get her feet under the table, get her ministerial team working. It takes time. Even when you've got as superb a civil service machine as Britain does, it takes time to get things moving again. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if she did.
You've described a country that over the next couple of years is going to be uncertain, chaotic, in many ways a mess. And so how does the U.S., which of course our next 2 years is going to be very certain, unchaotic, orderly, how do we deal with Britain the most effectively?
Yeah. Well, as Sky rightly points out, it will be challenging for the United States. Not the least, and Americans tend to ignore this. Let me just quote you former President Bush. This is Dad, 41, not 43. And I once asked him this question, and he said, becoming president, and this was a relatively smooth transition, from President Reagan to President Bush, the elder. He said, it was rather like, he said, being the captain of an aircraft carrier going out to sea with a third of the crew and no aircraft. Because it takes so much time to actually get a new administration actually in place. I mean, I'm certainly one who agrees with Senator Susan Collins on this issue that we need to drastically cut back the number of presidential appointees who need confirmation. It's over 2,000. It's bonkers. And it just takes way too long. So there's a lot of chaos in any new administration, even if it's a handover from one party, from one president to the other of the same party, right? Now, as to working with Britain, there is a government now. There will be a government for the next. Certainly, David Cameron's mandate didn't run out. He didn't have to go to the country, as they would say, didn't have to call an election until 2020. So, if she wants to, and if she can ride that out. So there will actually be, in the short term, more political stability in Britain than there will be actually in the United States in terms of actually a functioning government, because we've got an outgoing president, who is a lame duck, and all the constraints of that, and it will take at least 6 months, if not more, for a new administration, even if it is to be, say, a Clinton administration, to get into place, get confirmed by the Senate, and so forth. I think a lot depends on what areas of collaboration that we're talking about. Because remember, Britain remains in the EU. It does still have that seat around the table in Brussels until it actually leaves. If it leaves. That may not happen, May not happen. The day-to-day intelligence relationship will continue absolutely without a second of interruption. That relationship is extraordinarily close. That will go on very, very smooth. The military-to-military relationship will go on without any difficulty whatsoever. I think the one thing the United States can do and should do, whoever the next administration is act as an honest broker between the other 27 members of the EU and the UK. Because it can do that. The United States has that much clout, yes it does, to go in and say, look, if there's going to be a Brexit, we hope there isn't, but if there is, we want it to be as soft as possible. Oh, and that means all of you other 27 member countries, don't try to take it out on the British, It's not in your interests, it's not in US interests, it's not in anybody's interests. And so I think the US has a key role to play as an honest broker in going in and spending. If I was tasking the next Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, I would have him or her on the plane or semi-permanently stationed in Europe for about the next year or so, because they can do a great deal of good in terms of diminishing tensions, helping everybody to see that it's in their interests that we get, if we do have a Brexit, which isn't by no means certain, we do have one, it's as soft as possible. Because, you know, Skye and I are old Cold War veterans. And during the Cold War, one of the foremost objectives of the KGB, of the Soviet Union, was to break the alliance between not just Britain and the United States, but Western Europe and the United States. The Brexiteers have done it without any help from Russia, right? What we need to be doing is what the United States needs to be doing is doing its utmost to try and put those pieces back together again. The United States has the diplomatic clout to do it, it has the power to do it, and I sincerely hope the next administration will do it. Because not just out of friendship for an old and valued friend, its closest friend and ally, namely Britain, but also because it's in Europe's interests, it's in America's interests. Let's not give the Russians another victory, shall we?
One time for last question. Amelia, you got it. Excellent question.
Excellent question.
You mentioned the need to foster a relationship with Germany that will still have that very important seat within the EU. But how specifically should the United States manage that relationship?
It's going to be very, very difficult to do. The first thing it will have to do is to establish, or at least, again, we are actually assuming that Brexit has happened, right? Because it may not. But if it did, the first thing the United States would have to do would be to establish the same level of trust with a German government that it has with London. And that's a heck of a long job. A big, big, big job. Secondly, it would also have to deal with some very difficult German demands. You may have wondered why, well, on one level you may have thought it was reasonable, on another level you may not have perhaps thought of this, but here it goes. Why was Angela Merkel so upset over Edward Snowden's his revelations about British GCHQ, British equivalent of the NSA, and the NSA, you know, basically spying on Europe, including Germany, right? Well, yeah, I mean, sure, you have to put this into its proper German context. You know, her experience as a former East German with the old Stasi and all of that horror, absolutely right. Sure, that's understandable. You then have to understand it against the background of, however, something else. The Germans have been knocking repeatedly on the door of the Five Eyes Club. Do you know what the Five Eyes Club is? The special intelligence relationship between the US and Britain, supported by Canada, Australia, New Zealand, right? And the United States, despite all that palaver, basically told Merkel, sorry, Angela, old thing, but it ain't happening. You know, you're not getting in. Sorry, not happening. You know, there's not going to be a special relationship because German intelligence, for example, doesn't have the global reach that Britain does. You know, it just doesn't. It doesn't have an agency with the resources, the global reach of MI6. It doesn't. British secret intelligence. It doesn't. That's just for starters, right? Then you've got the military relationship, right? Now, although there have been terrible cuts in Britain's defense capabilities, at least Britain still has some warships. Does Germany have any? You know? One or two frigates, you know? Britain will soon have two 80,000-ton carriers with Type 45 destroyers, one of which, by the way, the HMS Queen Elizabeth, will be forward deployed in the Persian Gulf. Right? Can you see the Germans doing that? No. Can you see the Germans coming out of the embarrassing position? It happened just a year or so ago in Kurdistan, the German defense minister wanted to show, alliance solidarity, global war on terror, Germany shipping weapons to the Kurds, right? Fine, okay. To use against ISIS. Fine, super. Great stuff. Champagne all round. Except that the aircraft carrying the German spare parts, to the poor German defense minister's mortification, couldn't take off from its base in Germany because it didn't have it had mechanical problems and they didn't have enough spare parts to fix it. Then you've got the very large number of former German politicians who are basically on the payroll of the Kremlin. Oh yeah, there's a lot of those around who are going around saying, "Oh, please don't dare! Oh, you shouldn't hurt poor Mr. Putin. Poor, nice, fuzzy, cuddly Mr. Putin." An awful lot of German, including, by the way, Gerhard Schroeder, former German chancellor, on a lot of retainers from the Russians. Yeah. Germany's just a little bit too vulnerable. I mean, Angela Merkel's been fine, but I mean, Angela Merkel's not going to be there forever. You could see an SPD, a German Social Democratic Party chancellor, cozying up, doing footsie-footsie with the Russians. And after all, look at how much energy Germany gets from Russia and the worries about losing that energy. In other words, Germany's just too vulnerable and just doesn't have capabilities, it doesn't have the resources, it doesn't have the political will to substitute for Britain as that partnership. It just doesn't. There's a big incentive for the United States to act as honest broker and get cracking on it quickly.
And I think I'll end on this because with respect to the impact of what we say as a country, to the extent that we as a country affirm the importance of the transatlantic relationship and the alliance, it has a steadying effect on the whole thing.
It does.
To the extent that we raise questions about the integrity of that commitment, then it creates uncertainty all around. And so that's a question for us, and I won't say any more because we are nonpartisan and not affiliated. Now you understand, for those who are hearing Dr. Raymond for the first time, why he is an annual event here. Tremendous insight, tremendous perspective, and always good humor and candor as well. Please join me in thanking Dr. Raymond for